My name is Megan Wright. I'm 29 years old, and this is the story of how my fiance's parents shut me out of their lives completely until years later, when they suddenly decided they wanted me back. If you've ever felt invisible to people who were supposed to welcome you, this one's for you. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from. They never said they hated me. They never screamed or slammed doors in my face. But somehow, their silence was louder than any words could have been. It wrapped around me like cold air, making me feel small, unwanted, and completely out of place every single time I stepped into their world. And here's the thing. Silence like that doesn't just hurt in the moment. It changes you. It makes you question everything about yourself, wonder if you're too much or not enough, and eventually, it teaches you to protect your own peace at all costs. I spent years trying to be seen by people who had already decided I wasn't worth their attention. But when they finally reached out after all that time, I had already learned the most important lesson. My worth was never theirs to decide. If you're enjoying this story so far, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a like, because what comes next is going to show you exactly why boundaries matter more than approval. What I'm about to share with you isn't just about rejection. It's about what happens when you stop waiting for permission to feel worthy and start building a life that doesn't need validation from people who never saw you in the first place. So buckle up, because this story has more layers than I ever expected it to. I met Daniel Wright when I was 24 years old, fresh out of grad school and working my first real job as a marketing coordinator in Portland. He was charming, grounded, and had this quiet confidence that made me feel safe. We fell in love fast, like the kind of love where you just know deep down that this person is going to be part of your story forever. Within a year, we were talking about the future, and by year 2, he proposed on a rainy Saturday morning in our tiny apartment kitchen. No big production, no crowd, just us, coffee, and a ring he'd been hiding in his sock drawer for weeks. But while Daniel and I were building something beautiful together, his parents were building walls. Mr. and Mrs. Wright, Thomas and Patricia, were the kind of people who smiled politely but never asked questions. They were civil, sure, but there was always this invisible barrier between us, like I was a guest who had overstayed her welcome before I'd even arrived. At first, I thought it was just typical new girlfriend skepticism. I figured they needed time to warm up to me, to see that I genuinely loved their son and wasn't going anywhere. So I kept showing up, kept trying, kept hoping that eventually they'd let me in. I was engaged to the man I loved, and that should have been enough. But when the people who raised him look at you like you're a temporary inconvenience, it starts to chip away at your confidence. I'd catch Patricia glancing at me across the dinner table with this tight-lipped expression, like she was tolerating my presence out of obligation. Thomas would nod politely when I spoke, but his eyes never really focused on me. They'd drift past, as if I were background noise. And Daniel? He loved me fiercely, but he also loved his parents, and navigating that middle ground became the hardest part of our relationship. This is how exclusion became my awakening. Not all at once, but slowly, like water wearing down stone. The first time I really felt it, that cold, deliberate exclusion, was about 6 months into our engagement. Daniel mentioned casually one Sunday morning that his family had gone out for brunch the day before. His sister Emma had been in town, and apparently the whole family gathered at this cozy little spot downtown that Patricia loved. He talked about the pancakes, the laughter, how his dad told some old story about their childhood dog, and then he paused, realizing what he'd just said, and his face fell. I wasn't invited. I hadn't even been told it was happening. I remember standing there in our kitchen, spatula in hand, trying to keep my voice steady as I asked, "Oh, I didn't know Emma was visiting." He looked uncomfortable, mumbled something about it being last minute, but we both knew the truth. It wasn't last minute, they just didn't want me there. After that, I started noticing the pattern everywhere. Family dinners happened without invitations, or worse, with invitations that came through Daniel, not directly to me, as if I were an accessory he could bring along if he chose to. Holiday plans were made in group chats I wasn't added to. When Emma posted photos on social media from family gatherings, I'd scroll through and see everyone smiling, arms around each other, captions about family time, and grateful for these people. I was often physically there in some of those moments, but somehow never in the frame. It's a strange kind of hurt, being erased from moments you were actually present for. If you've ever felt like you're fighting for a spot at a table that was never set for you, hit that like button and stay with me, because this feeling only gets heavier before it gets lighter. It felt like knocking on a door no one planned to open. I'd show up with homemade dessert, ask thoughtful questions, remember birthdays, offer to help in the kitchen, all the things you're supposed to do when you're trying to become part of someone's family. But every effort was met with polite thank yous and tight smiles that never reached anyone's eyes. Patricia would accept my dish with a nod and set it aside, barely touched by the end of the night. Thomas would shake my hand like I was a business associate, not his future daughter-in-law. And Emma, sweet as she was, seemed caught in the middle, kind to me in private but distant when her parents were around, as if showing me warmth might somehow betray their unspoken disapproval. I kept being polite, patient, understanding, because that's what I thought I was supposed to do. I told myself that love takes time, that families have their own rhythms, and that eventually, if I just kept showing up with grace and kindness, they'd see me for who I really was. So I smiled through the awkward silences. I laughed at jokes I didn't quite catch because I wasn't part of the inside references. I sat at the edge of conversations, waiting for an opening that never came, while they reminisced about memories I'd never be part of. I even defended them to Daniel when he'd get frustrated on my behalf, telling him it wasn't that bad, that I understood, that we just needed to give it more time. But here's the truth. Every single time I walked into that house, I felt smaller. I'd spend hours getting ready, making sure I looked put together, rehearsing topics I could bring up that might spark real conversation. And every single time, I'd leave feeling like I'd failed some test I didn't know I was taking. One Thanksgiving, I spent an entire day making this elaborate pumpkin cheesecake from scratch. Patricia had mentioned once, months earlier, that it was her favorite dessert. I thought maybe this would be the thing that broke through, you know? Some small gesture that showed I was paying attention, that I cared. When I brought it out after dinner, she glanced at it, said, "Oh, how thoughtful," and then suggested we have the pie her sister brought instead. I sat there, fork in hand, watching everyone rave about that store-bought pie, and I wanted to disappear. I told myself, they'll come around. I repeated it like a mantra every time my chest tightened with that familiar ache of not belonging. But every effort only made the silence louder, because the harder I tried, the more obvious it became that nothing I did was ever going to be enough. They had decided who I was before they ever really knew me, and no amount of homemade cheesecake or patient smiling was going to change that. What I didn't realize yet was that this quiet humiliation was teaching me something crucial, that you can't earn love from people who've already chosen not to give it. Daniel loved me. I never doubted that. He'd tell me every day, in 100 different ways, that I was his person, his future, the one he wanted to build a life with. But when it came to standing up to his parents, he hesitated. Not because he didn't see what was happening, but because confrontation wasn't in his nature. He'd grown up in a household where conflict was smoothed over with silence, where uncomfortable truths were left unspoken to keep the peace. So when I'd come home from another family gathering feeling invisible, he'd hold me, apologize, promise to talk to them, but the conversation never seemed to happen. Or if it did, nothing changed. If this is resonating with you, make sure you're subscribed and drop a like, because what I'm about to share gets even more complicated. I stood beside him, yet alone in the room. That's the best way I can describe it. Physically, he was there, holding my hand under the table, giving me reassuring glances across the living room. But emotionally, when it mattered most, I was on my own. There was this one dinner, about 8 months before the wedding, where Patricia made a comment about how some people just don't understand family traditions. She said it while looking directly at me, right after I'd suggested we start a new tradition of everyone sharing what they were grateful for. The table went quiet. Daniel squeezed my hand but said nothing. Emma looked down at her plate. Thomas cleared his throat and changed the subject. And I sat there, cheeks burning, realizing that no one was going to defend me. That loneliness taught me an early lesson about self-worth. Love isn't just about the words someone says when you're alone together. It's about whether they stand beside you when it's uncomfortable, when it costs them something. Daniel's silence in those moments hurt more than his parents' coldness, because I expected resistance from them. But from him, I expected protection. I expected partnership. Instead, I got apologies in private and avoidance in public. And slowly, painfully, I started to understand that I was going to have to be my own advocate, because waiting for someone else to fight for me was only making me smaller. I replayed every word I'd ever said around them, analyzing my tone, my body language, my laugh, wondering if I'd been too loud, too opinionated, too much. Late at night, when Daniel was asleep beside me, I'd stare at the ceiling and run through conversations like they were crime scenes, searching for the moment I'd ruined everything. Maybe I shouldn't have mentioned my career ambitions so confidently at that first dinner. Maybe I came across as arrogant. Maybe I should have asked more questions and talked less about myself. Maybe the problem wasn't them at all. Maybe it was me, and I just couldn't see it. Wondered if I was too much, or not enough. That's the cruelest part of rejection. It doesn't just hurt. It makes you doubt your entire existence. I started changing little things about myself, testing theories. I wore more conservative clothes when I visited them, thinking maybe my style was too casual. I toned down my personality, laughed quieter, contributed less to conversations. I even started researching their interests. Thomas loved vintage cars, Patricia was into gardening, hoping that if I could just find the right topic, the right angle, I could finally connect with them. But nothing worked. The walls stayed up, and I kept shrinking, trying to fit into a space that was never going to open for me. Rejection has a way of turning inward. It stops being about what they did and becomes about what's wrong with you. I started believing their version of me, the one where I wasn't quite right, wasn't quite worthy, wasn't quite family, and that belief seeped into other parts of my life. I became quieter at work, second-guessed my ideas in meetings, apologized for taking up space. Daniel noticed, asked if I was okay, but I didn't know how to explain that his parents' silence was slowly erasing me, that the version of myself I'd been before I met them, confident, warm, unapologetic, was disappearing, replaced by someone desperate for approval from people who'd already decided I'd never have it. One day, I stopped trying. It wasn't a dramatic decision or some big confrontation. It was quieter than that. More like a switch flipping inside me after years of being in the on position. We were at Daniel's parents' house for a Sunday dinner, and I was doing what I always did, helping set the table, asking Patricia if she needed anything, smiling through the small talk. And then, mid-conversation, I just stopped. I excused myself to the bathroom, looked at my reflection in their perfectly clean mirror, and saw someone I barely recognized. My shoulders were tight, my jaw clenched, my eyes tired. I realized I'd been holding my breath around these people for almost 3 years, and in that moment, I decided I was done. Not out of anger, but exhaustion. That's the thing people don't tell you about rejection. It's not always the sharp sting that breaks you. It's the slow, constant weight of it. The way it presses down on your chest day after day until you can barely breathe. I wasn't mad at them anymore. I wasn't even hurt, really. I was just tired. Tired of performing. Tired of hoping. Tired of waiting for a breakthrough that was never going to come. So I stopped initiating. Stopped bringing homemade desserts. Stopped asking Daniel when the next family gathering was. I showed up when I had to, for his sake, but I stopped pretending it didn't cost me something every single time. Distance felt like oxygen after years underwater. For the first time in a long time, I could breathe without that constant tightness in my chest. I stopped checking Emma's social media to see if I'd been cropped out of photos. Stopped rehearsing conversations in my head before family dinners. Stopped trying to decode every glance and comment for hidden meaning. And you know what? They didn't even notice. Or if they did, they didn't care. Life continued exactly as it had before. Except now I wasn't destroying myself trying to fit into a family that had no room for me. Daniel noticed, though. He asked if I was okay. And for the first time, I told him the truth. I wasn't. And I hadn't been for a while. I focused on my career, my peace, my growth, all the things I'd been neglecting while pouring energy into a relationship that only drained me. I threw myself into work, took on projects I'd been too afraid to pursue, started saying yes to opportunities I'd previously turned down because they conflicted with family obligations that never truly included me anyway. Within 6 months, I got promoted to senior marketing manager. My boss told me I'd come alive in a way she hadn't seen before, that my ideas were sharper, my confidence stronger. And she was right. I had energy again because I wasn't spending it all trying to be seen by people who'd chosen to look away. If you've ever had to step back from toxic situations to find yourself again, hit that subscribe button and drop a like. Because this part of the story is about reclaiming your power. I stopped waiting for validation that never came. I started going to therapy, which was probably the best decision I made during that entire period. My therapist helped me see patterns I'd been blind to, how I'd learned to make myself small to avoid conflict, how I'd internalized their rejection as proof of my inadequacy, how I'd been seeking permission to exist from people who were never going to grant it. She asked me once, if you knew, with absolute certainty, that Daniel's parents would never accept you, would you still want to marry him? And I didn't have an answer. Not right away. Because I'd spent so long believing that their approval was required for my happiness, I'd never considered what my life could look like without it. Like a plant, I grew away from the shadow. I reconnected with friends I'd drifted from, picked up hobbies I'd abandoned, started building a life that felt like mine again. Daniel and I were still together, still planning our wedding, but something fundamental had shifted. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for his parents to change, not for him to defend me. Not for some magical moment where everything would suddenly be okay. I was building my own foundation, one that didn't require their acceptance to stand strong. And honestly, that's when I started to feel like myself again. Not the smaller, quieter version I'd become around them, but the woman I'd been before I ever walked into their home, confident, capable, and completely worthy, with or without their approval. Years went by without calls or apologies. Daniel and I got married in a small, intimate ceremony, just close friends and the people who'd actually shown up for us over the years. His parents were there, of course, seated in the front row with polite smiles frozen on their faces, but they felt like strangers playing a part rather than family celebrating a union. Patricia wore beige and left right after dinner. Thomas shook my hand, again like a business transaction, and told me I looked nice. Emma hugged me tightly and whispered, "I'm sorry," though I never asked her what for. After the wedding, the contact became even more sparse. Occasional holiday texts, perfunctory birthday cards with no personal message. And honestly, I stopped caring. Our life became full, stable, and calm. Daniel and I moved into a beautiful townhouse closer to my work, adopted a rescue dog named Charlie, and built routines that felt like home. We had Friday night dinners with our real chosen family, friends who asked how we were doing and actually listened to the answer, who showed up when we needed them, who made space for us without conditions. I got another promotion. Daniel started his own consulting business. We traveled, laughed, argued about whose turn it was to take out the trash, and built the kind of quiet, steady love that doesn't need external validation to thrive. His parents became background characters in our story, people we saw maybe twice a year, nodded at politely, and then returned to our actual lives. Their absence stopped hurting and started empowering me. That's the shift that surprised me most. For so long, I'd carried their rejection like a weight, let it define how I saw myself, let it convince me that something about me was fundamentally unlovable. But as time passed and life got fuller without them, I realized their opinion had never been the problem. The problem was that I'd given it so much power. I'd let people who didn't know me, who'd never tried to know me, determine my worth. And once I took that power back, everything changed. I didn't need their love anymore because I'd learned to give it to myself. I didn't need their acceptance because I'd built a life where I was already accepted, already celebrated, already enough. One message broke the long silence. It was a Tuesday afternoon, completely ordinary. I was at my desk reviewing a campaign proposal when my phone buzzed with a text from a number I hadn't heard from in almost 2 years. Patricia. "Hi, Megan. Hope you're well. Thomas and I would love to catch up with you and Daniel soon. It's been too long. Let us know when you're free." I stared at that message for a full minute, reading it over and over, trying to make sense of the sudden shift. No acknowledgement of the years of silence. No explanation for why now. Just a casual, polite invitation as if we'd been close all along and had simply lost touch. If you're as confused as I was in that moment, make sure you're subscribed because what happens next is going to blow your mind. Polite words, vague apologies, careful tone. Over the next few days, more messages came, longer ones, with phrases like, "We know we haven't been as present as we should have been," and "We'd really like to be more involved in your lives." Patricia mentioned that Emma had been talking about how happy Daniel seemed, how strong our marriage looked from the outside, how she regretted not being closer to us. Thomas sent a separate message saying he'd been thinking about family legacy lately, about what matters in the long run. They were testing the waters, extending tentative olive branches wrapped in careful language that apologized without actually apologizing, that acknowledged distance without taking responsibility for creating it. It felt like reopening a scar that had healed. Because here's the thing, I'd done the work. I'd spent years processing that rejection, learning to stop seeking their approval, building a sense of self that didn't require their validation. I'd grieved the family I thought I'd be gaining when I married Daniel, made peace with the reality of who they were, and moved on. And now, after all that time, after all that silence, they wanted back in? Part of me wanted to laugh at the audacity. Part of me wanted to ask what had changed, what had finally made me worthy of their attention. But mostly, I just felt tired all over again. Not the exhausting tired of trying to earn their love, but the heavy tired of knowing I was about to have to make a choice I'd hoped I'd never face. Part of me wanted closure. There was this tiny, stubborn piece of my heart that had never fully let go of the hope that maybe, just maybe, they'd see me one day. That they'd realize they'd been wrong, that I wasn't the problem, that I'd been worth knowing all along. Reading Patricia's messages stirred up feelings I thought I'd buried years ago. Not the desperate need for approval I used to have, but something softer and more painful. A kind of sad wondering about what could have been if they'd just given me a chance from the beginning. If they'd welcomed me with open arms instead of closed doors. If I'd gotten to experience what it felt like to have in-laws who actually wanted me around. Another part remembered every ignored moment. Every family gathering where I sat on the outside. Every holiday photo I was cropped out of. Every time Daniel squeezed my hand under the table, because he knew I was hurting but wouldn't say anything to defend me. Every homemade dessert left untouched. Every conversation that went silent when I entered the room. The memories came flooding back, not with the sharp sting they used to carry, but with a dull, persistent ache that reminded me exactly how much it had cost to survive their rejection. And I realized that forgiveness, if I even wanted to offer it, didn't mean pretending none of that had happened. Forgiveness and access are not the same thing. My therapist had told me that once, years ago, and it had taken me this long to really understand what she meant. I could forgive them for being closed off, for not knowing how to welcome someone new, for whatever fears or prejudices had kept them from seeing me. I could release the anger and hurt I'd carried for so long. But forgiveness didn't mean I owed them a relationship. It didn't mean I had to let them back into the life I'd worked so hard to build without them. It didn't mean their sudden change of heart erased years of silence and exclusion. I could forgive and still say no. I could wish them well and still protect my peace. Some bridges collapse for a reason. I kept thinking about this image my therapist had shared with me years ago, during one of our sessions when I was still deep in the pain of trying to connect with Daniel's parents. She'd said, "Imagine a bridge between you and them. You've been walking across it for years, carrying heavy stones of effort, and they've been standing on the other side, watching you struggle but never meeting you halfway. Eventually, that bridge collapses under the weight. And when it does, you have to ask yourself, was it ever strong enough to hold both of you? Or were you the only one trying to keep it standing?" That image had haunted me then, but now it made perfect sense. Not every crossing deserves rebuilding. Just because someone suddenly wants to reconnect doesn't mean you're obligated to hand them the tools and do the construction work all over again. Patricia and Thomas had years, literally years, to reach out, to make an effort, to show me I mattered. They could have called after the wedding. They could have checked in during holidays. They could have asked Daniel how I was doing, sent a text on my birthday, made any small gesture that showed I existed in their minds as more than just their son's wife, but they didn't. And now that they'd decided they wanted a relationship, I was supposed to forget all of that and welcome them with open arms. That didn't sit right with me. Sometimes the ground you stand on matters more. I'd built something solid over the past few years, a foundation of self-worth that didn't depend on other people's approval, a life filled with people who actually chose me, a marriage that had grown stronger once I stopped waiting for his parents' validation. That ground was sacred to me. It had taken too much pain, too much work, too many therapy sessions and late-night conversations, and moments of choosing myself to let anyone shake it. And I realized that protecting that ground, protecting my peace, wasn't selfish or petty or unforgiving. It was necessary. It was survival. It was the most loving thing I could do for the woman I'd become. I responded calmly, without reopening doors. It took me almost a week to figure out what to say, and I rewrote that message probably 20 times before I finally hit send. I didn't want to be cruel, but I also didn't want to pretend everything was fine. So I kept it honest and clear. Hi, Patricia and Thomas. Thank you for reaching out. I appreciate the message, and I'm glad to hear you're both doing well. Daniel and I have built a really beautiful life together over these past few years, and we're in a good place. I think it's important to be honest. The distance between us wasn't accidental, and reconnecting would require some deeper conversations about the past that I'm not sure I'm ready for right now. I wish you both nothing but the best. Simple, respectful, boundaried. No revenge, no drama, just boundaries. Daniel read the message before I sent it and nodded slowly, his eyes a little sad but understanding. He'd grown too over the years, watching me struggle and heal, and I think part of him had been waiting for this moment, for me to finally choose myself over his parents' sudden change of heart. He told me he supported whatever I decided, that he loved me, and that his parents' approval had never been a requirement for our marriage. Hearing him say that out loud, clearly and without hesitation, meant more to me than any apology his parents could have offered. Patricia responded a few days later with a short, "We understand. The door is always open if you change your mind." And that was it. No pushback, no guilt trip, no desperate plea, just acceptance, which was almost more telling than anything else. Silence this time was my choice, and that made all the difference. For years, their silence had been a weapon, something that hurt me, diminished me, made me feel unworthy. But this silence, the one I was choosing, it felt like power. It felt like self-respect. It felt like finally understanding that I didn't owe anyone access to my life just because they'd decided, years too late, that they wanted it. I wasn't closing the door out of spite or bitterness. I was closing it because I'd built something precious on the other side, and I wasn't willing to risk it for people who'd already shown me exactly who they were. Maybe one day things would change. Maybe one day there'd be space for a different kind of relationship. But right now, I was choosing peace. And that felt like the most honest, most loving decision I'd ever made. I didn't need their acceptance to feel whole. That realization didn't come all at once. It was built slowly, painfully, over years of learning to see myself through my own eyes instead of theirs. There was a time when their rejection felt like proof that something was fundamentally wrong with me, that I wasn't enough, wasn't worthy, wasn't the kind of person who deserved to be loved unconditionally. But standing on the other side of all that pain, with a life I'd built deliberately, and a sense of self I'd fought hard to reclaim, I finally understood the truth. Their inability to see me was never about my worth. It was about their limitations, their fears, their inability to make space for someone who didn't fit their expectations. And none of that had anything to do with who I actually was. My worth was never in their hands. It was always mine to define, mine to protect, mine to honor. And the moment I stopped looking to them for validation was the moment I started truly living. I stopped shrinking, stopped apologizing for taking up space, stopped believing that love was something I had to earn through perfect behavior and endless effort. I started showing up as my full self, messy, confident, opinionated, warm, all of it. And the people who were meant to love me did, without conditions, without hesitation. Daniel loved me fiercely, Our friends celebrated me. My career flourished. And I loved myself in a way I never had before. Not despite the rejection, but because I'd survived it and chosen myself anyway. Walking away was not weakness. It was strength. It would have been easier in some ways to say yes when Patricia and Thomas reached out. To let them back in, smooth things over, pretend the past didn't matter. That's what I'd been taught to do my whole life. Make peace, avoid conflict, prioritize other people's comfort over my own truth. But I'd learned something crucial through all those years of pain and healing. Real strength isn't about keeping everyone happy. It's about knowing your worth and protecting it, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it disappoints people, even when it means walking away from relationships that look good on paper but feel hollow in practice. So I walked away, not with anger or bitterness, but with clarity and peace. And that, more than anything, was my victory. If this story touched you, you're not alone. I know how isolating it feels to be rejected by people who are supposed to welcome you, to pour everything you have into relationships that never give back, to question whether you're too much or not enough. But here's what I need you to hear. Their inability to see you has nothing to do with your worth. You are allowed to choose yourself. You're allowed to set boundaries. You're allowed to walk away from people who make you feel small, even if they're family, even if they suddenly decide they want you back. Your peace matters more than their comfort, and protecting what you've built isn't selfish, it's sacred. I shared this story because I wish someone had told me years ago that it was okay to stop trying, okay to let go, okay to build a life that didn't require approval from people who refused to give it. If you've been waiting for permission to choose yourself, this is it. You don't need their validation. You never did. The life you build on your own terms, surrounded by people who actually see you and celebrate you, is worth so much more than any relationship you have to beg your way into. And if you're still in the thick of it right now, still trying to earn love that should be freely given, I see you. It gets better. Not because they'll change, but because you will. Watch the next video about choosing peace over approval, because healing stories like this deserve to be shared, and you deserve to know you're not alone in this journey. Subscribe if you haven't already, hit that notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what part of this story resonated with you most. Have you ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting your peace? Let me know below. I read every single comment, and your story matters just as much as mine. Thank you for being here, for listening, and for choosing yourself today. I'll see you in the next video.